We've been getting a lot of questions about tools I use, materials, techniques that I use for doing fiberglass projects. And so we decided this week to do kind of a how-to video. And I'll go over specifically the tools that I use and the materials, the fiberglass and the epoxy, as well as techniques for doing a small fiberglass project on your own. So I hope that this can be helpful to someone who is going down the road of doing their own fiberglass project. If you have any questions after this is over, we'd love to hear them. You can put them in the comment section. I'm happy to answer. If this is not your thing, we'll be getting back to back to the boat project next week. We have lots of exciting stuff happening on the boat. My name is Matt. Follow along as I turn Duracell, the legendary ocean racing sailboat, into a comfortable cruising home. This is the little shelf I'm going to be laminating in today. I'm going to be gluing it and taping it in all around the whole perimeter. How it's going to work is I'm going to glue it down on the edges of the seat back and the little baffle that's in here, and then we'll cove and tape around the perimeter. Safety wise, what I'm using are just my regular latex gloves. I'm using acetone and epoxy, and I don't want to get either of those things on my skin, so I make sure I wear my gloves for both of those. For the acetone, I definitely wear a mask with carbon filters on it for the organic vapors. And then I will be adding colloidal silica to the epoxy, which is very light stuff. It gets all over in the air. And so I have dust filters on my respirators. So I wear this whenever I'm dealing with dust, and then also acetone. As far as epoxy, this epoxy specifically doesn't have any organic vapors, and so it's not necessary to wear an organic vapor filter with the epoxies that I use anyway. So these are all the tools and materials that I use for a very basic lamination project. Acetone is something I use pretty exclusively as my cleaning agent, especially when doing epoxy work. And before I lay down any epoxy or fiberglass, I always clean really well with acetone. As far as like brands or anything, I'm not sure. I just go to the paint store and get, a gallon at a time. Here I'm cutting away peel ply before taping fiberglass to this corner. So before we go any further, we have to start talking about the epoxy that I use. Epoxy it's the glue that's holding the entire project together. We use the Total Boat high performance epoxy. It's a 2-to-1 mixing ratio, which means you use 2 parts resin to 1 part of the hardener, which makes it really easy to mix. I generally use either a medium or a slow hardener. The hardeners come in different speeds, and so you can get fast, medium, or slow in this case. I use medium in the winter time because it's a little bit colder out. The ambient temperature changes how fast the epoxy will cure. And so in the winter time, I use medium speed because it's cooler outside. As it warms up in the summertime, I use slower hardener. And it's just because I have lots of time it gives me lots of time to get my projects done, but without having to wait forever for the epoxy to cure. It does need to stay, above 50 degrees generally for the epoxy to get a really good cure. Like in my garage here, my garage isn't heated, so what I end up doing is I build an oven around my projects in case I need to get it, in case it's cold out and I need the epoxy to make sure it sets up really well. This 2-to-1 epoxy also doesn't blush, which other epoxies sometimes after it's cured, they leave a layer of what are called amines on the surface, which are really bad for applying new coats or more epoxy to the top of. They have to be wiped off. That's the nice thing about this 2-to-1 epoxy is they don't leave any amines. They also come with these pumps, and so these pumps are really nice because since they're 2-to-1, the pumps are pre-calibrated. So this is the hardener pump, and you just press it once, and you press the resin pump once, and you get a 2-to-1 mix automatically. We really like this stuff. I've gone through a ton of it. It's performed excellent. Total Boat does sponsor our project, which we appreciate very, very much. It's an excellent product. Properly mixing your epoxy is a very important step. I try to mix for about a minute while making sure to scrape the sides and bottom of the container so all the resin is mixed really well with the hardener. Another thing I use many times a day are these mixing cups. Mostly, I would say at least 75% of the time I'm using these quart cups, and I only mix up about them to be about half full. They're really important to have, especially since they have the scales on the side of them to measure out whether you're mixing epoxy or any other chemicals for paint or whatever. The other thing that's really nice about them is that you can clean them out, so they're very much reusable. Especially with epoxy, you can pop out the old epoxy that's in there, get it all out, and then keep reusing them. So if you take care of them, you can reuse them, 10 times. But yeah, I always recommend at least the quart cup. This is a great safety tip we got from a viewer. I cut a hole in a cardboard box for the vacuum hose to fit in. I mixed the filler with the epoxy inside the box, so most of the filler that flies out of the container while mixing gets vacuumed up, keeping it out of the environment. So the next thing is, this is called colloidal silica. This is a filler that goes into my epoxy. So after I've mixed the amount of epoxy that I want to use, and I'm going to do any filleting or filling before fiberglass is laid down. This is what I'll mix into the epoxy, and what it does is it makes the epoxy more like a very thick glue. For instance, if I'm taping, when I'm taping one surface that's perpendicular to another, I will put what's called a fillet or a cove into that corner, and it allows the fiberglass to transition from one plane to the other plane without a hard bend in it. And so I can mix a bunch of this stuff into the epoxy, and it makes it really thick, like peanut butter pretty much, and it goes really nicely into those corners. Heavy Ziploc bags are really handy for inserting thickened epoxy into corners and gaps. I wrap the bag into a mixing cup, and only as much of the bag is necessary, so that when I pull the bag out of the cup with the epoxy in it, the epoxy is already in the bottom corner. You waste less epoxy this way. And then I cut off the corner, and you have a kind of epoxy frosting dispenser. I use my yellow spatula and a little tongue depressor stick. And these are really, really basic tools you'll find at any chandlery. I love them. There are other fancier tools you can get, or you can make your own. I find these to work just fine for almost all the projects that I'm doing. After I've cleaned off the squished out epoxy from gluing down the shelf, I'm on to filleting the corners. I dispense the glue into the corner and then go over it with my tongue depressor. The tongue depressor makes a nice radius in the corner for the fiberglass to lay over. If I don't dispense enough in the corner, I use excess that I've cleaned off from other areas to fill in the gaps. I make sure that the fillet is consistent over the entire seam and all gaps and exposed foam is coated with the thickened epoxy. Excess epoxy will also get pushed off the edge of the radius, which I clean up later with the opposite edge of the tongue depressor. I also keep acetone in my bucket. This is the screw lid bucket, and this is what I keep all my tools in. And so acetone keeps my tools clean. It's just, there's like, I don't know, 2 inches of acetone in the bottom of the bucket. Next, I mix more resin for laminating the fiberglass tape. This is just clear resin with no fillers. For taping especially, I have my little paint tray that I use, and so I mix my epoxy into a bucket, and then I pour it in here, and then I just roll out my epoxy from the paint tray. I also use, especially for taping, I use my little weenie roller. The cover that I use is a nap cover. I just get these at the hardware store. They're a lot better than foam rollers because you can press the resin out of them really well. I find foam rollers, it's just hard to, foam rollers don't hold resin as well as this does. And I almost use this as my fiberglass roller first, so I kind of go over my fiberglass with this really, really well, both to wet out the fiberglass, but also to, press it into the substrate. Using the weenie roller, I always wet out the area to be fiberglassed with resin before putting the fiberglass down. This is so the fiberglass will stick to the substrate, making it easier to wet out, and so the fiberglass/epoxy matrix has a total bond between the substrate. Now, I should point out that I like to apply my fiberglass to the fillet in the corner while the fillet is wet. A lot of people like to wait for their fillet to cure and then apply the fiberglass after sanding the cured fillet. My epoxy cures very slowly, so I have lots of time to laminate the fiberglass to the fillet before it's cured. The fillet can get misshapen while applying the glass, but my rollers will push it back into shape.
Ready?
The advantage I see of doing it this way is you eliminate the step of waiting for the fillet to cure and then needing to sand. And you get a chemical bond between the fiberglass and the fillet. It does take more practice though. So this one is a big one to talk about, is fiberglass. In general, I try to keep it really simple on myself and limit myself to just a couple kinds of fiberglass so that I don't get paralyzed by indecision, basically. The majority of my projects, I use what's called a 17-ounce biaxial. It's a 45-45 biaxial fiberglass, which means that rather than the fiberglass being woven together, it is just 2 layers of fiberglass that are stitched together. So there's the layer on top is going 45 degrees to the stitches, and then the other side is going the opposite direction to the stitches. And so they're laid on top of each other like that. The reason I use this stuff a lot is mostly because I'm really, really used to it, I would say. But it's also really great for like getting fiberglass into corners. Since it's stitched together, it has a lot of stretchability, maneuverability to get into the corners and everything. It's pretty heavy stuff, and so it's very, very strong. You can also get it in 12-ounce. For some reason, the 17-ounce in my experience is a little bit cheaper than the 12-ounce. I'm not sure why. The other fiberglass I use a lot of, if I'm not doing something that's extremely structural, then I use, this is just a 6-ounce fiberglass cloth tape, and so this stuff is actually woven together. It's one over the other, and in a 0-90 degree pattern. This is only 3 inches wide. I usually get 4-inch wide tapes. This stuff is also really easy to use. The nice thing about using this stuff is you use less epoxy with it. This is 17 ounce, so I use probably 3 times the amount of epoxy. that I use for wetting this stuff out. With these smaller taping projects, I tend to cut the fiberglass I need as I'm going. If you like to be more prepared, cut all your tapes to length beforehand and you have them ready to lay down. Once they're laid down on the fillet, I roll the resin over the glass, making sure that the fiberglass is totally saturated. A really good laminator will only use as much epoxy as necessary to saturate the glass. Try not to have your fiberglass floating in resin, but too little resin is arguably worse, as unsaturated fiberglass is doing nothing for the reinforcement. These are fiberglass specific scissors, but they're super sharp and great for cutting fiberglass. When I'm laminating, I just keep them in my pocket. I prefer to mix smaller batches as I go along, as opposed to one big batch. I waste less resin this way. In larger batches, epoxy can get too warm and exotherm. This is an uncontrolled buildup of heat that cures the resin before you can use it and be dangerous. After the fiberglass is saturated using the weenie roller, I go over everything with the fiberglass roller. This will make sure all air bubbles are out from underneath the glass and it has total adhesion to the substrate, and the radius of the roller pushes the fiberglass into the radius of the fillet. And this is just specifically a fiberglass roller I just get from the chandlery. And what it's for is making sure that the fiberglass is pressed onto the substrate that you're laminating to and getting any air bubbles out from underneath it. And so it helps to press it into the corners. If you're trying to jam the fiberglass into the corner, press it up against the fillet that you made. They come in all different shapes and sizes. This one it's like a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch roller, diameter roller, and 4 inches wide. It's just the most basic one, and I use it a ton. Again, here I'm wetting the area to be glassed with resin before applying the glass. This being an outside radius, the corner is rounded with a rounding bit on a handheld router. This way the fiberglass lays over the corner without separating from the substrate. With these outside radius laminations, I like to wet out half of the tape lengthwise first, and then push down the other half of the tape over the radius so it kind of stretches the tape over the corner. This just ensures that no bunching happens over the radius. And then lastly, I use peel ply over almost everything that I have laminated. The peel ply goes on top of the fiberglass after I have wet it all out and rolled all the air bubbles out of the fiberglass from underneath it. And then I put down a layer of peel ply on top. And what the peel ply does is it brings the epoxy to the surface, and it makes it so that when you peel the peel ply off, the surface of the fiberglass is consistent. If you don't put peel ply on here, you will have the fiberglass texture exposed, and so it's a lot harder to sand, and you end up breaking a lot of the fiberglass strands. If you break the strands, then the fiberglass isn't working as well. The peel ply brings the epoxy to the surface. It leaves a texture that you don't have to sand for most coats of other stuff to put on. Like if I'm going to put more epoxy on top, I don't have to sand it. If I'm going to put paint on, for a lot of paints you don't have to sand it. So, and it pulls the blush off if there's, or the amines off if there's any of that on top of your epoxy. So it's really handy. It's an extra step. It's an extra expense. There are other ways to avoid using this. Some people call it a hot coat or a fill coat, where if you've laid down your fiberglass and you wait till the epoxy gets tacky, then you can go over it with another coat of even thickened epoxy, and just to fill in the grain, and it makes it so that the surface, like I said, is it's a lot easier to sand and a lot more consistent. So there are many ways to do all of this stuff. These are the materials that I choose to use for my project. Peel ply works best when it is totally absorbed with the fiberglass area, and dry spots between the fiberglass and peel ply have to be sanded. I wipe the peel ply with an extra peel ply sheet because it slides nicely against itself and helps to press the two together. You can also roll more epoxy on top of the peel ply in case the peel ply isn't getting saturated from underneath. Okay, so this whole thing is taped in all around the perimeter, just this shelf. I'm sure you're wondering, what about the underside? And for this piece, the only thing it needs to do is basically hold our backs as we sit against it, and so this is enough material for it to do what it needs to do. I am going to cut holes in the seat back with removable hatches, so maybe we can store stuff in there, but I'm not going to worry about accessing the underside of the shelf and taping it in. That'll work for now.
Any words of encouragement for someone who might be thinking about doing a fiberglass project?
Just takes practice. Your first few won't be beautiful, but as long as you get all the epoxy or all the fiberglass wet out and all the air bubbles out from underneath it, it works. So it'll get prettier as you do it more and more. We have a few more Patreons to thank this week. If you're interested in joining the Patreon community, you can find us at the Duracell Project on patreon.com. So first, thank you to John and Ann. They have a boat on Long Island that they cruise around the Northeast. They do charters down in other places as well. They recently went up to Maine on their own boat. So thank you very much to John and Ann. And then we haven't heard from Florian or Paul yet, but thank you very much to both of them.